They said legacy is what a man leaves behind, but no one ever asks what he buried to build it. The voice cut softly through the low hum of the ballroom as the camera of the moment seemed to settle on every polished surface, every crystal glass catching the warm gold of the chandeliers above, the air thick with quiet admiration and expensive cologne as Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it all, shoulders squared, silver hair perfectly in place. A man who had spent 40 years building an empire that people now toasted with raised glasses and practiced smiles, the applause rolling toward him in waves that felt endless, controlled, deserved. And yet just beneath the surface of that perfect image something trembled, something unseen, as if the light itself hesitated before touching him, as if the room knew a truth it hadn't yet spoken, and still the applause went on, louder, fuller, until it reached that peak where sound becomes pressure and expectation hangs heavy in the chest. And then, just as the master of ceremonies stepped forward to close the night, two figures rose from the front table, small movements at first, almost missed, but undeniable once they began walking toward the stage. Lily and Liana Caldwell, identical in posture and presence, their dark curls catching the light, their expressions steady in a way that didn't belong to celebration. Their heels echoing softly across the marble floor with a rhythm that cut through the applause like a quiet metronome. Measured, intentional, and Ethan noticed, of course he did, his smile shifting just slightly, not enough for the cameras to catch, but enough for something in his chest to tighten, because this wasn't part of the program. This wasn't rehearsed, and yet he welcomed them with open arms, a gesture perfected over decades of public life. "My daughters," he said, his voice warm, practiced, drawing another round of applause as they stepped beside him under the lights, but neither of them smiled back. The way daughters usually do in moments like this. There was no laughter in their eyes, no shared pride, only a quiet resolve that seemed to belong to something older than the room itself. And in Lily's hands, there was an envelope, worn at the edges, its color faded like something that had lived too long in the dark, something that had waited, and waited, and waited to be seen. "We wanted to give you something," Lily said, her voice clear but softer than the room expected, the kind of softness that forces people to lean in, to listen closer, to hold their breath without realizing it. And the room obeyed, the chatter dissolving into silence as if someone had dimmed the sound along with the lights. Ethan's gaze dropped briefly to the envelope, a flicker of confusion crossing his face before it disappeared beneath the calm he wore like a second skin. "A gift?" he asked lightly, but there was a question underneath that tone, something searching, something cautious, and Liana stepped closer then, her hand brushing against her sister's as if to steady the moment, or maybe to anchor it. "We found these," she said, and the word found seemed to land heavier than it should have, like it carried weight beyond paper and ink, like it carried years, and Ethan's smile paused, just for a second, just long enough for the air to shift, for the cameras to catch something they couldn't quite name, for the audience to feel a change they didn't yet understand. And Lily began to open the envelope, the sound of paper sliding against paper louder than it had any right to be in a room that size, louder than applause had been seconds before, louder than the quiet now pressing in from every corner. And as she unfolded the first page, the light caught the handwriting in a way that made it look almost alive, as if the words had been waiting for this exact moment to breathe. And when she spoke, she didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked straight at him. "Dear Ethan." And everything in the room changed. The words did not rush. They did not tremble. They landed with a quiet weight that pulled every eye tighter toward the stage. "Dear Ethan, I waited 3 days before writing this because I thought you just needed space, because I believed you would come back the way you always said you would." Lily's voice held steady but softer now, like each syllable carried something fragile that refused to break, and the room leaned into it. Every glass stilled midair, every whisper swallowed before it could form. Ethan did not move. Not yet, his hands resting at his sides, fingers slightly curled, as if holding on to something invisible, something slipping. "I told you I was pregnant the night before you left. You remember that, do not you? The way you looked at me like I had just changed the future without asking you first." A faint shift rippled through the audience, not loud, not obvious, but enough to turn admiration into curiosity, enough to tilt the balance of the room. Liana stepped closer beside her sister, her presence quiet but grounding, her eyes never leaving their father's face as if measuring every breath he took. You said you needed time, and I gave it to you. I gave you all of it. Lily continued, unfolding the second page slowly, deliberately. The sound of paper brushing against paper echoing sharper now, cutting through the silence like a blade made of memory. I wrote again the next week, and the week after that, and then I stopped counting because it started to feel like I was writing into something that was not empty, just closed. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the practiced calm still there, still intact, but no longer effortless, his eyes flicking briefly to the envelope in her hands, then back to her face, searching, calculating, trying to understand how something so small could shift the ground beneath him. I am not asking for anything anymore, Lily read, her voice dipping just slightly, not breaking, just deepening. I just need to know that you saw me, that you saw us, even if you decided we were not part of your life. A breath moved through the room then, collective, restrained, the kind that comes when people realize they are no longer watching a celebration, but something far more personal, far more real. And still no one interrupted, no one dared, because the weight of the moment demanded silence, demanded witness. Liana reached into the envelope then and pulled out another stack, thicker this time, edges uneven, pages that had been folded and unfolded too many times to count. There were more, she said quietly, not to the room, but to him. And that was when something shifted fully, something undeniable, because Ethan's expression finally changed, not dramatically, not enough for a headline, but enough for truth to begin showing through the cracks. Confusion first, sharp and immediate, followed by something heavier, something closer to realization. I never received these, he said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer certain, and the words did not echo the way his speeches usually did. They fell instead, landing somewhere between defense and disbelief. Lily did not answer him right away. She simply held his gaze, the kind of steady gaze that does not accuse, does not beg, only reflects. And then she unfolded another letter, one more worn than the rest, its crease nearly torn through the center. This one was dated the day we were born, she said, and now the room was completely still. Not even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to exist anymore. I went into labor early this morning, she read, her voice softer than before, almost intimate, as if the words were not meant for a crowd but had found one anyway. I kept thinking you would walk through the door before it was time, that you would say you needed longer, but not forever. I named them Lily and Liana, because you once told me you liked names that sounded like they belonged together. Ethan's breath caught then, visible now, undeniable, his chest rising slower, heavier, as if the air itself had thickened around him. The image of control slipping further with every word spoken aloud. I will not write again after this, Lily finished, her voice steady to the end. Not because I stopped believing in you, but because I have to start believing in myself. The final words settled into the room like a quiet verdict, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had been hidden, everything that had been denied, everything that could no longer stay buried. And Ethan stood there, under the same lights that once defined his success, now exposing something far more human, far more fragile, as the truth continued to unfold in the hands of the two people who had every right to hold it. The silence did not break. It deepened, pressing against every wall of the ballroom until even the soft clink of glass fell out of place. And Ethan stood there with the weight of words he had never heard, now echoing louder than any applause that had come before, his eyes fixed on the letters as if they might rearrange themselves into something less final, something he could still control, but they did not move. They did not soften. They simply existed, undeniable. And Liana stepped forward then, her voice calm, but carrying a steadiness that did not belong to hesitation. We thought the same thing you are thinking right now, she said, and the shift in tone pulled the room even tighter into her orbit. We thought maybe you never answered because you chose not to, because you decided we were not part of your story. Ethan's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, not yet, because something in her voice told him to listen first, to hear it all before trying to shape it into something else. and Lily lowered the pages just enough to let her sister continue. The two of them moving in quiet rhythm, like they had practiced not the performance, but the truth. But that is not what we found, Liana said, her gaze steady, unblinking. We found every letter still sealed, still dated, still waiting, tucked inside a box that was not meant to be opened. A murmur rippled faintly through the crowd, quickly swallowed again by the tension that refused to release, and Ethan's brow tightened, confusion cutting sharper now, because this was no longer just about absence. This was about interference, about something placed between him and a past he thought he understood. "Where did you find them?" he asked, his voice lower than before, stripped of the confidence that usually filled it, and the question did not sound like authority. It sounded like someone searching for a missing piece of himself. Lily answered this time, lifting the envelope slightly as if it held more than paper, as if it held years. "In the East Wing storage room, behind files that were not labeled, in a cabinet that required a key we were not supposed to have," she said, each detail landing carefully, deliberately. "We were not looking for you. We were looking for old photos, something for tonight, something to celebrate you." And that word celebrate seemed to shift meaning in the air, no longer light, no longer simple. "But instead we found this," she continued, and for a moment her voice softened, not with doubt, but with something closer to understanding of a silence that had shaped more than just her childhood. Ethan's shoulders dropped just slightly, the kind of movement that would have gone unnoticed in any other room. But here, under these lights, under this silence, it spoke volumes, because he knew that room, he knew that cabinet, he knew who had access to it. And the realization did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, painfully, like a truth he had never thought to question. "That cabinet is not for personal records," he said quietly, almost to himself, but the words carried, and Liana nodded once, not in agreement, but in confirmation. "We know," she said. "That is why it did not make sense at first, why something so personal would be placed somewhere so hidden, somewhere so controlled." The room seemed to lean forward again, waiting, not for explanation, but for accountability, for something that would bridge the gap between the man they admired and the truth now unfolding in front of them. And Ethan's gaze shifted away from his daughters for the first time, moving out into the crowd, scanning faces he had known for decades, colleagues, board members, family friends, people who had stood beside him through every milestone, every deal, every carefully constructed moment of success. And somewhere in that sea of familiar faces, something unfamiliar settled in his chest, something that felt like doubt, like memory reworking itself in real time. "I did not," he began, but the sentence did not finish, because he did not know how to finish it. Not without certainty, not without understanding what had truly happened. And Lily lifted another letter then, but she did not open it. She simply held it between her fingers, letting it exist in the space between them. "You do not have to explain it yet," she said, her voice gentler now, but no less firm. "Because we already know one thing for sure." Ethan looked back at her, something raw now visible beneath the surface, something unguarded. "What is that?" he asked, and the question carried more weight than any speech he had given that night. And Lily met his eyes without hesitation. "That she never stopped writing," she said, and the words settled into him in a way nothing else had, not as accusation, not as anger, but as truth, simple and complete. And the room held that truth with them, all of them, under the same light that had once been meant to honor a legacy, now revealing something far more complicated, far more human. As the past continued to rise, one letter at a time, the air did not move. It held, suspended between what had been believed and what was now impossible to ignore. And Ethan felt it settle around him like something heavier than judgment, heavier than doubt, something closer to realization that had arrived too late to be softened. His eyes drifting again toward the envelope in Lily's hands, then to the stack Liana still held against her chest, as if those pages contained not just words but years he had never lived, years that had existed without him. "We read all of them," Liana said quietly, her voice no longer just steady but certain, grounded in something that could not be undone. And the room shifted again, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to make the silence feel different, no longer waiting, now listening. Every date, every stamp, every line she wrote hoping you would answer. She continued, and there was no accusation in her tone, only clarity, the kind that comes when truth has already been accepted. She wrote on holidays, on birthdays, on days that meant nothing to anyone else but everything to her. Lily added, lifting another page, not to read yet, but to let it exist in the space between them. She wrote when we took our first steps, when we said our first words, when we started school, and every time she ended the letter the same way. Ethan's breath slowed, his focus narrowing, as if the room had faded away and only those words remained. Only that connection he had never known. How did she end them? He asked, and this time his voice carried something new, something unguarded, not authority, not control, but need. And Lily unfolded the page with care, her fingers tracing the crease before she spoke. She ended them by saying, I will not make you choose us, but I will never stop believing you would have if you had known. The sentence settled into the room like something sacred, something too honest to be reshaped, and Ethan closed his eyes for just a second, a small moment that felt larger than anything he had done all night, because it was the first time he was not performing, not holding, not directing the moment, but standing inside it, feeling it. And when he opened them again, the certainty he had built his life on had shifted, cracked in a way that could not be repaired with explanation alone. I did not know, he said quietly, not to the audience, not to the cameras, but to the two people standing in front of him. And the words were not a defense. They were a realization, late and incomplete, but real. And Liana nodded once, acknowledging it without softening it. We believe you, she said, and that sentence carried its own weight, because belief did not erase what had happened. It only clarified where the truth needed to go next. But not knowing is not the same as not being responsible, she continued. And the room seemed to tighten again, because this was no longer just about hidden letters. This was about everything that had been allowed to happen without question, without pause. You build a life where nothing reached you unless it was approved, filtered, controlled, Lily said, her voice calm but direct now, no longer just reading the past but connecting it to the present. And somewhere in that system, someone decided she did not belong in it. Ethan's gaze dropped for the first time, not out of avoidance, but out of recognition, because he knew the systems he had built. He knew the layers of protection, the barriers between him and anything that could disrupt the image he had spent decades refining. And now those same barriers stood in front of him as something else entirely, something that had kept more than criticism away, something that had kept truth out. Who had access to that cabinet? Liana asked, and the question did not feel like an interrogation. It felt like an opening, a path forward that required honesty instead of control. And Ethan's jaw tightened again, not with resistance, but with the weight of memory aligning with possibility, with faces, names, decisions he had trusted without question, and the realization moved through him slowly, like something unfolding in real time, something he could no longer avoid seeing. There are only a few people who could have placed something there, he said, his voice lower now, steadier in a different way, not practiced, but grounded. People who managed my private records, my correspondence, my family communications, and the words seemed to echo differently now, because they were no longer abstract. They were specific, tied to choices, tied to trust, tied to a structure that had quietly shaped everything around him. And Lily stepped closer then, not to confront, but to stand, to hold the space between them with something stronger than anger, something rooted in truth. Then this is not just about what was hidden, she said. It is about what was allowed. And the sentence lingered, stretching across the room, across the years, across the silence that had once protected him and now exposed him. And Ethan looked at his daughters, really looked at them, not as part of his legacy, not as extensions of his name, but as individuals who had carried something he never knew existed. And in that moment, under those lights, with every eye on him and nowhere left to redirect the truth, he understood that what stood in front of him was not just the past returning. It was the beginning of something he could no longer control. Only face the silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt complete, as if every word that had been hidden for years had finally found its place in the room. And Ethan stood there with his shoulders no longer squared for performance, but grounded in something heavier, something real, his gaze slowly moving back to his daughters, the only two. People who had carried the truth without ever being given the chance to speak it until now. "Where is she?" he asked, and the question did not sound like control. It sounded like something deeper, something closer to regret shaped into words, and Lily and Liana exchanged a glance, brief but meaningful, the kind of glance that carries history without needing explanation, and Liana stepped forward just slightly, her voice calm, but holding something that shifted the weight of the moment even further. "She did not come tonight," she said, and the answer settled into the room with a quiet finality that no one expected, because for the first time, the absence was not mysterious, it was intentional, and Ethan's expression changed again, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to see that something inside him had shifted beyond control, beyond image, into understanding. "She was invited," Lily added softly, her fingers still holding the worn edge of the envelope as if it connected her to something far beyond the stage. "We made sure of it. We told her everything we planned to do. We asked her to be here." A pause followed, not long, but enough to let the weight of that choice settle into every corner of the room. "And she said no." Liana finished, her voice steady, not defensive, not emotional, just clear, and Ethan inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that does not prepare a response but absorbs a truth. Because in that single word no there was more power than anything spoken. Aloud that night, it was not rejection, it was decision. It was the quiet line drawn by someone who had already carried enough. "Why?" he asked. And this time the question did not search for blame. It searched for meaning, and Lily looked at him with something softer now, not sympathy, but recognition of a man who was finally asking the right question, even if it came years too late. Because she said this moment was never about being seen. She answered, and her voice carried a quiet strength that mirrored something deeper, something inherited. She said she did not spend years protecting her dignity just to stand in a room where she had to prove it. The words landed gently but firmly, and the room seemed to shift again, not with tension now, but with understanding, because what had been revealed was no longer just about hidden letters or missed years. It was about choice, about how someone decides to stand even when no one is watching. And Ethan lowered his gaze for a moment, not in defeat, but in reflection, the kind that comes when the truth does not accuse you but simply exists, asking nothing, demanding nothing, and yet changing everything. "She told us something else," Liana continued, her voice softer now, as if the words she was about to say carried something sacred, something that belonged more to memory than to the room. "She said if you ever heard those letters, it should not be because she brought them to you." Ethan looked up again, his eyes fixed on hers, no longer searching, just listening. "Then why?" he asked quietly, and Lily stepped closer, her presence steady, grounding. "Because she believed the truth should come from the people it lived in, not the person who survived it," she said, and the sentence settled over everything, over the stage, over the audience, over the man who had built his life on control and now stood in a moment defined by something else entirely, something he could not direct, could not rewrite. And for the first time that night, Ethan did not try to respond immediately. He did not reach for explanation or defense. He simply stood there, letting the truth exist fully in front of him, in his daughters, in the letters, in the silence that no longer felt like pressure but like clarity, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, he took a step forward, not toward the audience, not toward the cameras, but toward them, toward the two people who had carried what he never knew existed, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than before, stripped of performance, grounded in something new. "Then I need to hear all of it," he said. And it was not a command, not a request, but a commitment, simple and unguarded. And Lily looked at Liana once more before nodding, unfolding the next letter with care, as if each page now held not just the past, but the beginning of something that had waited far too long to be understood. And as the paper opened under the light, the room leaned in again, not out of curiosity now, but out of respect, because what was happening on that stage was no longer a moment of exposure. It was a moment of truth finally being given the space to exist without interruption, without control, and for the first time, Ethan Caldwell was not the man at the center of the story. He was the one listening to it. The paper unfolded slowly, the faint crease catching the light like a scar that had never fully healed. And Lily did not rush as she began to read again, her voice softer now, but somehow carrying further, deeper into the silence that had transformed from tension into attention. Dear Ethan, today they asked me what their father does, and I realized I do not have an answer that does not sound like a story I made up. The words drifted into the room, and something in them shifted the atmosphere again. Because this was no longer about beginnings or endings, it was about the years in between, the quiet spaces where life happens without witness. I told them you build things, that you make decisions that affect people you will never meet. And they smiled like that was enough, like that meant you were real. Lily paused just slightly, not to break the moment, but to let it settle, to let the image form fully in the minds of those listening. And Ethan felt it, not as an idea, but as a reality he had never been part of, his daughters hearing stories of him as if he were distant, almost imagined, and yet standing here now, tangible, present, too late to change what had already shaped them. Liana asked me if you would ever come to her school play. Lily continued, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. And I told her I did not know, not because you would not want to, but because I did not know if you knew she existed. A quiet shift moved through the audience, not loud, but enough to carry something heavier than sympathy, something closer to understanding the depth of absence. And Ethan's throat tightened, the weight of each sentence pressing against him in ways no public criticism ever had. Because this was not about perception, it was about truth, unfiltered and unprotected. I keep writing because it feels like leaving a door open. Lily read, her voice softening further. Not for you to walk through, but so they can see that I never closed it. The sentence lingered, stretching across the room, across the years, across the distance that had once seemed permanent, and Liana stepped closer beside her, her hand resting lightly against the stack of letters as if grounding the moment. There is more, she said quietly, and the words did not feel like a warning. They felt like a continuation, because this story had never been meant to stop where it had been hidden. And Ethan nodded slowly, not because he was prepared, but because he understood that preparation no longer mattered. Only truth did. And Lily unfolded the next page, her fingers careful, deliberate, as if each movement carried respect for something that had waited far too long to be heard. Dear Ethan, they are older now, and they do not ask about you as often, not because they stopped caring, but because they learned how to carry questions without answers. The room seemed to draw in again, not from tension now, but from the quiet weight of what those words revealed, the kind of growth that does not come from guidance but from absence. I do not correct them when they imagine you differently than you are, she continued, because I realized something I should have understood sooner, that who you are to them is not defined by what you did not do, but by what they needed you to be. Ethan's eyes lowered slightly, not in avoidance, but in reflection, the kind that does not seek escape but acceptance. And for the first time, there was no movement from the audience, no subtle shift, no whispered reaction, only stillness, complete and shared. I stopped writing to ask for anything. Lily read, her voice steady, unwavering, and started writing so one day, if they ever found these, they would know that silence was never the same as absence, and that dignity does not disappear just because someone fails to see it. The final words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not as an ending, but as a truth that no longer needed explanation, and Lily lowered the page slowly, her breath even, her posture unchanged, as if she had not just carried years of someone else's voice into the open. And Ethan stood there, the man who had once controlled every narrative now standing in one he had never written, never shaped, and yet could no longer deny. And in that moment, under the same light that had once defined his legacy, he did not look at the audience. He did not look at the cameras. He looked only at the letters, at the space between what had been and what now stood before him. And for the first time in his life, the silence did not feel like something to fill. It felt like something to understand for a moment. No one moved, as if the weight of everything that had just been spoken had pressed the entire room into stillness. And then Liana stepped forward again, her fingers brushing lightly against the remaining letters, not with hesitation but with intention, like someone who understood that what came next was not about adding more, pain, but about revealing what had endured through it. "There is one more," she said, her voice quieter now, but carrying a clarity that did not need volume to be heard. And Ethan looked at her, his expression no longer guarded, no longer searching for control, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar even to him. Because whatever this last letter held, he knew it would not accuse him. It would define something far deeper than that. And Lily nodded slightly before unfolding the final page. The paper softer, more worn than the others, as if it had been held more often, read more times, lived with rather than hidden away. "Dear Ethan," she began, and the words felt different immediately, not heavier, but steadier, like something that had reached its own conclusion long before this moment arrived. "I am writing this knowing it will likely be the last one, not because I have run out of things to say, but because I have finally said everything I needed to understand." The room seemed to lean into her voice, not out of tension now, but out of something closer to reverence, because this was no longer about absence, it was about resolution. "They are strong, stronger than I ever expected, and not because life was easy for them, but because they learned how to stand without waiting for someone else to hold them up." Ethan's chest rose slowly, each word settling into him with a weight that did not crush, but reshaped. "I used to wonder what I would say to you if you ever stood in front of me again, if I would ask you why, if I would tell you how much it mattered that you were not there." Lily paused briefly, not breaking the flow, just allowing the words to land fully before continuing. "But I realized something over time, something I hope you understand one day, that absence is not always a choice made in cruelty. Sometimes it is the result of silence allowed to grow too long." Ethan's gaze dropped then, not out of shame, but out of recognition, the kind that comes when truth meets memory and begins to align. "So I chose not to carry anger, not because it was not justified, but because it was not the life I wanted for them." Liana's hand rested gently against her sister's arm, grounding the moment as the final lines approached. "If they ever find these letters, I hope they read them not as a record of what was missing, but as proof of what remained, that love can exist without being returned, that dignity does not require acknowledgement to be real." The words filled the room in a way that no applause ever could, quiet but complete. And if you are hearing this now, it means they found their own way to bring the truth forward, not for me, but for themselves, and for that, I am proud of them in a way that does not need to be seen to be felt. Lily's voice softened just slightly on the final line, not with emotion that wavered, but with something steadier, something resolved. "Take care of them, if they allow it, and understand that what you do next will matter more than what you did not do before." The last word settled into the air like a quiet ending, not abrupt, not dramatic, but final in a way that left no space for misunderstanding. And Lily lowered the page slowly, her hands steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had not just carried an entire life into the open, and for a moment nothing followed. No reaction, no movement. Only the stillness that comes when something true has been fully spoken, and Ethan stood there, the man who had once defined himself by control now standing in a moment defined by something else entirely, something he could not shape or redirect, only accept. And he looked at his daughters, really looked at them, not as symbols of a legacy, not as extensions of his name, but as individuals who had grown without him and yet stood here now, offering him something he had never earned but still had the chance to honor. And slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer, not as a gesture for the room, not as a performance, but as a man choosing to close a distance that had existed for far too long, his voice quiet when it came, but clear, grounded in something that had finally found its place. "I do not deserve to ask for anything from you," he said, his eyes steady on theirs, "but I will spend the rest of my life making sure I do not waste what you have given me tonight." And the room did not erupt. It did not break into applause, because what had happened here was not a moment to celebrate. It was a moment to witness. And in that silence, under the same lights that had once defined success, something far more important had taken its place, something that did not need recognition to be real, only truth, finally spoken and finally heard. The silence did not dissolve into relief. It transformed into something steadier, something that held the room together instead of holding it back. And for a long moment no one reached for applause, no one shifted to reclaim the comfort of routine, because what had unfolded on that stage had changed the shape of the night in a way that could not be reversed, and Ethan stood there with his daughters in front of him, not separated by distance anymore, but not yet close enough to call it repair, and he understood that space. That it was not something to cross quickly, but something to respect, something earned over time. "We are not finished," Liana said softly, and her voice did not interrupt the moment. It continued it, guiding it forward with the same quiet certainty that had carried every word before, and Ethan looked at her, not with surprise now, but with attention, the kind that listens without preparing a response, and Lily stepped slightly to the side, placing the letters carefully on the podium, not discarding them, not closing them, but leaving them visible, present, as if they belonged there now, in the open, under the same light that had once hidden them. "We did not bring these letters here just for you," Lily said, her tone calm, measured, carrying something beyond personal revelation, something that reached into the room itself, and the audience seemed to shift again, not physically, but in awareness, because they were no longer observers of a private truth, they were part of its witness. "We brought them here because silence does not only affect the people inside it," she continued, her gaze moving briefly across the room before returning to Ethan. "It shapes everything around it, every decision, every relationship, every version of truth that people accept without question." And her words did not accuse the room. They invited it to reflect, to recognize that what had been revealed on this stage was not isolated. It was connected, woven into systems, into choices, into structures that had been trusted without being examined. And Ethan followed her gaze for a moment, seeing the faces that had once represented stability, support, certainty, and now carried something else, something quieter, more uncertain, as if they too were rethinking what they had accepted as truth. "For years, this room has celebrated control," Liana added, her voice steady, not confrontational, but clear, the ability to shape outcomes, to manage information, to decide what is seen and what is not. A faint shift moved through the audience again, not discomfort exactly, but recognition, because those values had built the very world they all stood in. "But tonight is not about control," she said, and her words landed with a calm finality. "It is about what happens when truth does not need permission anymore." And the sentence settled into the space between them, not heavy, not sharp, but undeniable, and Ethan felt it, not as a challenge, but as a turning point, something that did not erase what he had built, but redefined what it meant. And he took a slow breath, his posture no longer rigid, no longer held together by expectation, but grounded in something more honest, something still forming. "Then let it stay here," he said quietly, his voice carrying further than before, not because it was louder, but because it was no longer shaped by performance. "Let it stay in the open." And the words did not sound like a statement for the room. They sounded like a decision for himself, and Lily nodded once, not in approval, but in acknowledgement, because this was not about agreement, it was about direction, and she stepped back slightly, giving the space back to him, not as a gesture of return, but as an invitation to continue differently. And Ethan turned then, not to the audience as a speaker, but as a man standing in front of people who had seen something real, something unfiltered. And for a moment he did not speak. He simply stood there, letting the silence hold, letting the truth remain where it was without rushing to reshape it into something more comfortable. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the practiced rhythm they were used to, none of the polished certainty, only something simpler, something more human. "There are things I did not know," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "And there are things I chose not to see." The distinction hung in the air, clear and deliberate, and the room did not react. It listened, fully now, without expectation. "Both matter," he continued, "and both are mine to face." And the sentence did not seek forgiveness, did not seek understanding. It simply existed as truth, and in that moment, under the same lights that had once defined his success, Ethan Caldwell was no longer controlling the narrative, he was standing inside it, allowing it to be what it was, and the room, for the first time that night, did not wait for what would happen next. It understood that what mattered had already begun. The room did not return to what it had been. It settled into something new, something quieter and far more honest, and Ethan stood there with the weight of everything no longer pressing down but anchoring him in place. His eyes moving slowly from the letters resting on the podium to the two women standing in front of him, not as symbols of what he had missed, but as proof of what still existed. And for a moment he said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood that words, for once, needed to follow truth, not lead it. And Lily and Liana did not rush him, did not fill the silence. They stood with the same steady presence that had carried them through every word spoken that night. And the audience remained still, no longer waiting for a performance, only witnessing what came next. And Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that settles something deep rather than prepares something outward. "There is one thing I can do right now," he said, his voice calm, not elevated, not directed outward, but grounded in the space between them. And he turned slightly, not toward the crowd, but toward the table behind him where the program of the evening still lay neatly arranged. Untouched since the moment everything had shifted, he reached for it, not hurried, not dramatic, and lifted it just enough for the light to catch the printed words that had once defined the structure of the night. And for a second he looked at it, at the carefully planned order of speeches and acknowledgments and closing remarks that no longer held meaning in the same way. And then, without force, without spectacle, he set it down, turning it over, leaving it face down on the table. And the gesture was small, almost quiet, but it carried something unmistakable, a decision to let go of the script that had guided everything before this moment. And when he turned back, there was no trace of the man who had entered the stage earlier that evening with certainty and control, only someone standing in front of two daughters with a truth he could no longer reshape. "I cannot change what you lived without me," he said, his eyes steady on theirs. "And I will not pretend that understanding it tonight fixes anything." The words were simple, unembellished, and that was what gave them weight, because they did not try to resolve what could not be resolved in a single moment. "But I can choose what happens from here," he continued, and there was no hesitation in that sentence, no searching, only clarity. And Lily watched him closely, not with expectation, but with awareness, the kind that recognizes intention without immediately trusting it. And Liana stood beside her, equally still, equally present, allowing the space to remain what it was, not rushing toward forgiveness, not stepping back from possibility, just standing in truth. And Ethan took one step closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to show direction, enough to make the space between them no longer accidental. "If you are willing," he said quietly, "I would like to start learning who you are, not as a father who expects something, but as a man who understands he has to earn the chance to be one." And the sentence did not reach for emotion. It did not attempt to move the room. It stayed where it belonged, between the three of them. And for a moment nothing followed. No immediate response, no resolution, only the quiet weight of what had been offered. And Lily glanced briefly at Liana, not seeking permission, but sharing the moment the way they always had. And then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged, steady, thoughtful. "We are not here to give you an answer tonight," she said, her voice calm, not distant, not cold, just honest. "We are here because this was the truth that needed to be said." And Ethan nodded once, slowly, accepting that without resistance, because for the first time, he understood that answers were not something he was owed. They were something that might come with time, or might not, and both outcomes were part of what he now had to face. And the room remained silent, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect, because what was happening on that stage was no longer a story unfolding for others. It was a moment belonging entirely to those standing in it. And Ethan looked at them again, not searching, not measuring, just seeing, fully, clearly, without the distance that had defined everything before. And he did not step closer again. He did not reach out. He simply remained where he was, grounded, present, and the lights above did not change, the room did not shift, but something fundamental had already moved, something that could not be undone. And as the silence held, it no longer felt like something waiting to be filled. It felt like something complete, a space where truth had finally been spoken, dignity had never been lost, and what came next would not be decided in a moment, but built, slowly, honestly, from here.